Hello from Blue Media Channel, everyone. Today, in our series on unknown modern wars, we continue with the second video, where we will closely examine Portugal's fierce resistance against India and the war India undertook to deliver the final blow to Portugal. We would be very grateful if you support our work by liking the video, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell. Enjoy the viewing. Following consecutive defeats, the Portuguese mounted one of their rare and strong resistances throughout the war. The Indians encountered unexpected resistance when they attacked Angitive Island, a deserted territory belonging to the Goa region. Portuguese sailors had retreated to defend the island, and as Indian sailors began to land on the island under artillery fire from the Indian Navy, the fierce battle ensued. Not only did the Portuguese sailors manage to repel the Indians, but they also killed 7 Indian sailors and wounded 19, including 2 officers among the casualties. The Portuguese defense was eventually overcome following intense bombardment from Indian warships. The island was captured by the Indians the next day, with all Portuguese defenders taken prisoner except for 2 corporals and 1 private killed. Meanwhile, Portuguese soldier Manuel Caetano escaped by swimming from the island and, after reaching the Indian coast, became the last Portuguese soldier to be captured in India. By the morning of December 18th, the target was the NRP Afonso de Albuquerque, the main force of the Portuguese Navy, anchored off Mormugao port. The ship had taken on additional tasks beyond combating the increased Indian naval forces, such as maintaining radio communication with Portugal after the destruction of radio facilities in air raids. In the duel between British-manufactured warships, 3 Indian frigates led by INS Betwa positioned themselves off the port to attack Afonso and secure sea access to the port. During this time, Indian warplanes bombed Mormugao port. Subsequently, INS Betwa and INS Bias raided the port, opening fire on Afonso with their 4.5-inch guns. The Portuguese, relying on maritime and naval tradition, responded to the Indians' calls for surrender by firing back with their 120mm guns. Afonso's last radio message to Lisbon was as follows: "We are under attack, we are responding." However, the Portuguese were at a significant disadvantage, as their 4 120mm guns could only fire 2 rounds per minute, compared to the Indian frigate's capacity to fire 36 rounds per minute. Shortly after the exchange of fire began, Afonso was directly hit in the control tower, injuring the gunnery officer. Then, an anti-personnel shrapnel bomb launched by an Indian ship exploded directly above the ship, killing the radio officer and severely injuring Captain Antonio da Cunha Aragao. The command was then taken over by First Officer Pinto de Cruz. Captain Aragao had handed over command to First Officer Sarmento Gouveia with the condition that they would not surrender. The ship's propulsion system was also heavily damaged in the attack. Despite this, the Portuguese continued to resist until a sergeant, contrary to the captain's orders, hoisted a white flag on the ship's flagpole, signaling surrender. However, since the Indians did not see the white flag, they continued their bombardment. After the bombardment, the white flag was raised again, and the battle for Afonso resumed. Afonso fired approximately 400 shells and managed to hit 2 Indian ships. After sustaining heavy damage, the order was given to abandon the ship. Under intense fire directed at both the ship and the shore, part of the crew, including the gunnery personnel, abandoned the ship and reached the shore. They were followed by the remaining crew, who set fire to the ship and went directly to the shore, including the injured commander, who was then transported by car to a hospital in Panaji. Thus, the Portuguese managed to hit 2 Indian warships and killed 5 and wounded 13 Indian sailors. The Portuguese patrol boat NRP Sirius, under the command of Lieutenant Marques Silva, was also present in Goa at the time. After observing Afonso run aground and losing communication with Goa Naval Command, they scuttled their ship. The crew narrowly escaped capture by Indian forces and fled to Pakistan on a Greek cargo ship. The Indians then moved to attack the Portuguese garrison in Damdan. Commanded by Major Antonio José da Costa Pinto, the garrison consisted of 360 soldiers and 230 police officers, with their most significant weaponry being 87.6 mm guns, although even these had insufficient and outdated ammunition. The Indian forces, consisting of a battalion and 3 companies, intended to conduct a surprise attack but failed and lost 3 soldiers when trying to capture the control tower. In response to Portuguese resistance, the Indians bombed Portuguese positions with French-manufactured Dassault Mystère 4 fighter jets. Subsequently, Indian artillery began bombarding Dalmau Grande. By 11:30 a.m., Portuguese forces resisting Indian advances at Verecunda's eastern border ran out of ammunition and retreated westward to Catra. At 12 p.m., following the withdrawal from Verecunda, a Portuguese artillery battery on the Rio São Carlos shore was ordered to fire at the Indians but instead, commanded by Captain Felgueiras de Souza, chose to surrender without firing. By 1 p.m., Portuguese forces at Calicaquigo's eastern border had completely exhausted their ammunition and retreated towards the shore. By 5 p.m., in the absence of resistance, the Indians had occupied most of the region, excluding the airport and Dalmau Pequeno, where the Portuguese last showed resistance. By this time, the Indian Air Force had conducted 6 more air raids, severely demoralizing the Portuguese forces. At 8 p.m., after a meeting among Portuguese commanders, a delegation was sent to initiate negotiations with the Indian lines, but they were fired upon and forced to retreat. A similar attempt by artillery to surrender the next morning at 8 a.m. also came under fire. The Indians attacked the airport the following morning, and by 11 a.m., the Portuguese surrendered without a fight. Major Costa Pinto, although injured, was carried on a stretcher to the airport since the Indians insisted on accepting the surrender only from him. Approximately 24 Portuguese officers, 600 soldiers, and police were taken prisoner by the Indians, who suffered 4 dead and 14 wounded, while the Portuguese had 10 dead and 2 wounded. The next target of the Indians was the Portuguese garrison in Dio, which arguably demonstrated the most successful defense and resistance throughout the entire war. This garrison was led by Major Fernando de Almeida e Vasconcelos, who commanded approximately 400 soldiers and police officers. The Portuguese defense successfully repelled the Indians' initial uncoordinated attacks by returning fire with 87.6 mm guns and mortars, inflicting heavy losses on the Indian forces. The Portuguese artillery managed to repel multiple Indian assaults, causing significant damage to the Indian forces. The Indians attempted once more to capture the airport directly but were again repelled by well-positioned Portuguese soldiers. The Portuguese Army's defense network, established with machine guns, paralyzed the Indian forces, forcing them to withdraw after repeated unsuccessful assaults. While Portugal claimed this heroic defense was achieved with only 8 soldiers, the Indians claimed they were resisted by 130 Portuguese soldiers. Forced to retreat under bombardment, the Portuguese had to abandon their positions in Passo Covo and withdraw to the town of Malala at dawn, further weakened by heavy artillery fire and bombardments from the Indian cruiser INS Delhi stationed off Dio. Subsequently, Portuguese commanders decided to surrender, resulting in 1 Portuguese governor, 18 officers, 43 sergeants, and 403 soldiers being captured. During the conflicts, 7 Portuguese soldiers were killed. The Portuguese governor later stated that they could have stopped the Indian advance for several more days, but surrendered due to the overwhelming power of the Indian Air Force and Navy. Without any Portuguese fighter aircraft, the anti-aircraft units on the ground were quickly overwhelmed by the Indian Air Force. Meanwhile, the Portuguese patrol boat NRP Vega, after detecting 2 Indian fighter jets and opening fire with its 20 mm Oerlikon gun without success, was attacked twice by the returning Indian aircraft, resulting in the deaths of the captain and gunner, and forcing the remainder of the crew to abandon the ship and be captured as prisoners of war. Portugal's complaint to the United Nations about India remained unaddressed due to Soviet support for India, paving the way for India's final assault. On the evening of December 18, the majority of Goa was invaded by advancing Indian forces, with over 2,000 Portuguese soldiers stationed at the Alparqueiros military base at the entrance to the port city of Vasco da Gama. According to the Portuguese strategy named Plano Sentinela, the defense forces were to show their last resistance at the port and withstand the Indian forces until reinforcements from the Portuguese Navy arrived. Orders from the President of Portugal required a scorched earth policy, insisting that Goa be destroyed before being handed over to the Indians. Salazar asked Vassalo e Silva to resist for at least 8 days, during which time he convinced himself that international support would be gathered against the Indian invasion. However, despite orders from Lisbon, General Governor Manuel Antonio Vassalo e Silva, considering the numerical superiority of Indian forces and evaluating the stocks of food and ammunition of his forces, decided not to obey Salazar to prevent unnecessary loss of life and decided to surrender to India the day after the Indian invasion. He sent a message to all Portuguese forces under his command stating, considering the defense of the Iberian Peninsula against enemy air, sea, and land fire, and taking into account the disparity between forces and resources, the situation does not allow us to continue the fight without sacrificing the lives of the residents of Vasco da Gama to a great extent. In view of my patriotism, I have decided to initiate contact with the enemy. I am ordering a ceasefire for all my forces. Thus ended Portugal's 451-year occupation in India, marking the end of an era and Portugal's golden age. In total, 4,668 Portuguese soldiers and civilians were captured by the Indian Army. After surrendering, Portuguese soldiers were held under harsh conditions by the Indian Army in their own military camps in Navelim, Aguada, Ponda, and Alparqueiros, sleeping on concrete floors and performing hard labor. A few years later, Indian Air Marshal Raghavendran would write in his memoirs, "I have never seen a group of soldiers look so miserable in my life. They were short, not well built, and definitely did not look like soldiers." The two-day conflict resulted in the deaths of 22 Indians and 30 Portuguese soldiers. Portugal's repeated appeals to the United Nations to stop India, described as the aggressor, were repeatedly rejected by the Russians, leading Salazar to comment that the effective power in the UN had now shifted to communist, African, and Asian countries. Salazar also expressed his frustration with England for ignoring Portugal's use of English airfields, stating, "Had it not been for this delay, we would certainly have found an alternative route and could have reinforced India with people and materials for its continuous defense." He suggested that, had their plans materialized, they might not have been defeated by India. The successful Indian operation was supported by Russia and Indonesia, while the United States, England, Brazil, the Netherlands, and Pakistan opposed it. China remained neutral. Feel free to ask in the comments if you have any questions. You can also share your opinions and requests with us. Stay tuned for more videos. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell to stay updated. Wishing you beautiful and healthy days ahead. Goodbye.